Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning at the launch of two different ESRI reports, but very much complementary to one another, looking at two aspects of migration, both the fiscal impact of migration, evidence on that, and also welfare receipt of immigrants in Ireland. Obviously, immigration is a very big topic at the moment, given the very rapid growth in Ireland's population in recent years, largely driven by inward migration. So the ESRI has been looking at a wide range of different aspects of the immigration, both experience, integration, impacts on the Irish economy and society. This morning, we're going to zoom in on two specific aspects of that, both the fiscal impact and the social welfare receipt of migrants. So these are part of a very broad-based research program on integration and migration that we have with the Department of Justice, Home Affairs and Migration. So these are, I think one of these is the 16th report in that series. So it looks at a lot of different aspects. So this morning's reports are really focusing in on sort of one specific aspect. So maybe that helps preempt some of the questions. We don't look at all impacts of migration on the economy or the labour market. We're very much focusing here on these specific aspects. Obviously, we'd like to thank the Department of Justice, Home Affairs and Migration for funding the research programme and for all the comments and input from the steering committee. So there's two papers. We're going to go from one presentation into the next and then keep all of the questions for the end. So people are very welcome to put questions in the chat there as we go along. The first paper is a literature review on the fiscal impacts of migration, and that's by Ciara Murphy, Evan Key, Anusha Alamir, and Daniel Capistrano. And it's Ciara who's going to front the presentation on that. She'll then hand over to Alan Barrett, who will present the research on social transfers amongst migrants and compare that to Irish-born. And that's co-authored with Anusha Alamir and Bertrand Maitre. And then Alan, Ciara, and some of the other co-authors of the two reports will be on hand to take your questions at the end. So with that, I'll hand straight over to Ciara. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Martina, and thanks everyone for joining. So as Martina mentioned, I'm going to present the first of the two papers, which is a literature review on the fiscal impact of immigration. Obviously, the context of this is that the economic contribution of immigration is kind of a major part of the public debate and also really matters for public policy questions around immigration. Migration has quite broad economic implications. So for growth, for things like innovation, productivity, the labour market. But it also has implications for the public finances, and it's really important to kind of separate those two things out. There's a lot of international literature on both the economic impact and the fiscal impact of migration. So this report looks at this international literature and asks basically, one, what conclusions can we draw about the fiscal impact, so the impact on the public finances of immigration in general, and what conclusions can we draw about the fiscal impact in Ireland? And again, really clear note, and we'll kind of discuss this throughout, that the fiscal impact is not the same as the economic impact. The fiscal impact looks at the much narrower question than the economic impact of the impact on the public finances alone. So there's a few things to think about before we actually answer these two questions on the kind of international question and the Irish question. And it's just, how do we actually think about the fiscal impact? So it can be quite easy to think that this is a relatively straightforward question to answer or to calculate. But actually, there's a lot of really important kind of philosophical and methodological questions that we need to answer first. So the first question is, what do we actually count? So the relatively straightforward way of approaching this is you look at direct taxes and spending. So what taxes do migrants pay? And then what kind of welfare receipts do they use? So just looking at kind of cash. But that doesn't account for services. So obviously a lot of state spending is on kind of in-kind services like education, health. And one of the really important questions here is, if you do want to look at those, which is really important to do to get a broader picture of the fiscal impact, how do you actually assess migration-related spending in those? So obviously that becomes a question of data, or it becomes a question of certain assumptions about, age profiles and usage of certain services. One of the most important questions in this literature is how you attribute what are called pure public goods. And these are basically things that the state has to spend or pay for, regardless of how many people live in the country. So it's not linked to the actual population and doesn't change if there are more people in the country or not. So it doesn't change with migration. So things like flood defenses, for example, responses to climate change, but also defense and running the legislature. So just kind of a lot of the background running of the state that will be paid for regardless. So the question is, do you attribute this to migrants? And then kind of if we spend a lot on defense, for example, or if some countries spend a lot on defense, then it's seen as kind of a fiscal negative for them? Or do you attribute that only to natives because it would have to be spent whether there were migrants or not in the country? And then, of course, one of the big questions and one of the really important questions is how do you actually count indirect effects? So, like I said, fiscal is kind of a narrower question than the economic effects, but migration also has effects on, GDP growth, productivity, innovation, the provision of care that enables natives to enter the labor market, or potential displacement of native workers. And all of those things have a knock-on effect on the fiscal situation as well. So they all have kind of potential positive or negative budgetary implications, and how you actually assess those potentially really matters. Generally, this leads to two different approaches in the literature. One is the accounting approach, where you literally try to take what the spending is and what the kind of income is from migrants. So this kind of looking at the actual budgets. And the other is this general equilibrium approach, which tries to say, okay, what are the indirect effects on the economy and how does that impact the public finances? Which, of course, is a more complex endeavor, but potentially a more accurate reflection of the fiscal impact of migration, but much rarer in the literature. Another really important question is when to actually count the fiscal impact. So one of the options is just taking a snapshot of today. Okay, in the year 2025, what's the budget balance? But the problem with this is that natives and migrants tend to have different life cycles. So if you assume that the snapshot of today reflects forever, you might not be accounting for the fact that, for example, a lot of migrants leave the country before they retire, and therefore their healthcare costs are going to be different in the future. And so therefore there might be implications for if you kind of assume that now reflects what the future fiscal impacts are also going to be. But if you want to do this life cycle analysis to try to understand kind of you project fiscal impact into the future, you need to understand migration trajectories, which is a lot of individual decision making on the part of migrants, and also how they're going to use services in the future, and also kind of future state policies and economic cycles. And that's called the static versus the dynamic approach. One thing that really needs to be said about looking at the fiscal situation in Ireland is that the year that we look at it matters a lot, in particular during the crash. So the scale of our fiscal deficits during the crash means that everyone was a fiscal negative in the state, essentially, because, in 2010, I think we had something like a 32% fiscal deficit. So if you kind of take that year and extrapolate, you're going to get quite a skewed picture of reality, or if you just look at the fiscal impact in those years, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the third kind of big question, and there are more that we go through in the report, is who is an actual migrant and who do you count as a migrant? So the big challenge in Ireland, and this is true of all of our research, if you've been to any of our presentations, you'll have seen this, is that the born abroad measure counts a lot of people who we would not count as migrants. So, people born abroad to the diaspora, to Irish immigrants who were living abroad for a short period of time, but who were born as Irish citizens. Also, people born in Northern Ireland as Irish citizens. But then citizenship counts quite a few people who are migrants who have naturalized. So trying to actually decide how to do that, and then things like how to attribute Irish-born children. Do you attribute the costs to their parents, or do you and how do you do that if a child has one migrant parent, for example? So there's lots of almost philosophical questions that need to be answered when you're talking about the fiscal impact of migration. And one really important caveat that really matters for the public debate in Ireland in particular is the fiscal impact question asks whether migrants covered their share of expenditure, in that they kind of contribute to the budgets to provide services, but it doesn't ask or answer the question of whether the state has the capacity to provide those services. And it doesn't capture things like indirect effects in markets. So, for example, if the supply of housing is not keeping up with migration, then there's going to be indirect effects in markets that might have kind of knock-on fiscal fiscal impacts that also matter. It also doesn't capture generally the role of migrant labor in supporting the expansion of public services. So I think construction is discussed a lot, healthcare is discussed a lot, things for growing population, aging population, but also the increased engagement of women in the workforce, so caring roles or improved service provision. So there's a lot of caveats to this, but there's also quite a bit that we can say. So the first question is, what does the international literature say, and what can we say about the fiscal impact of migration in general? Generally, what it says is that the fiscal impact is small as a percentage of GDP. The OECD found kind of a neutral fiscal impact overall when it looked comparatively. There was a few literature reviews that kind of said that the fiscal impact generally tends to be between 0.5% and 2% of GDP. And so both of those kind of find more or less within that range. And one thing that's kind of important to say is that there's a marginal effect that generally is not enough to offset aging. Now, of course, that doesn't account a lot of the time for the indirect effects on the economy, but this is not going to be kind of the budgetary panacea. It's not going to solve all fiscal problems, or, if there's a large fiscal deficit, resolve that fiscal deficit for the most part. Almost all papers that look at the migrant population as a whole find a positive fiscal impact. Two found a negative fiscal impact, but they all took the accounting approach. So again, kind of underestimating the indirect effects of migration on the economy, but overall a positive fiscal picture. And of course, the problem, like we said, is that the accounting approach is that it seems that the indirect effect matters a lot more for some groups than others. So it seems to be particularly important for low-skilled migrants and maybe kind of humanitarian groups. So some research has found that, so this really interesting piece of research found that both legal and illegal immigration to the US has a positive fiscal impact. And of course, illegal immigration pushes a lot of potential taxes kind of out of the state, depending on how your tax system is designed. And this study found that the legal migration had a positive fiscal impact directly through the taxes that were paid. So that accounting approach reflects that fiscal impact. And that illegal migration had a positive fiscal impact indirectly through job creation. So basically kind of demand creation in the economy. And this has been found by a few different papers. The Migration Advisory Committee has also mentioned the potential impact of, lowering the cost of providing public services. And one really interesting piece of work looked at the Mariel boat lift, which is a very famous case study in the migration studies field. It was a specific Cuban policy where a lot of Cubans arrived into Miami in particular, where there was already a Cuban population. And a lot of it was kind of people who had come from prisons, mental institutions, and were kind of being emptied out by the regime at the time. It increased the population of Miami by 8%, and they were largely low-skilled immigrants. And this study looked for the first time at kind of the fiscal impact of that and found no local fiscal impact in Miami. So generally kind of this idea that there's an equilibrium being reached. The OECD in 2021 did a large comparative piece, which we'll look at for Ireland in a minute. And they kind of asked the question of how does the overall positive fiscal contribution come about? And what they found is that immigrants tend to contribute less in taxes and other revenue, but the government also spends less on immigrants. So the two kind of balance out. But that's a nuanced story. So they found that the government tends to spend more on migrants in the areas of family and children, unemployment, social exclusion, and housing, which Alan is going to talk about in Ireland later. But they spend less on migrants in the areas of old age, sickness and disability, education, and health. So there's quite a nuanced picture about how this fiscal impact comes about. And just because there's more spending on migrants in one area doesn't necessarily mean that there's an overall kind of fiscal negative. And that means that the effect is mainly driven by migrants' younger age profile, which we will mention as well. The subgroup matters a lot, and kind of I touched on this. Labour immigration generally is positive, or the most positive, especially high skilled, and especially when you look at the accounting approach. And that's kind of unsurprising. It requires an employment permit first, especially in Ireland, and often has very high kind of salaries. And then other groups tend to be negative or neutral, again, from this accounting approach, that's education, family, humanitarian, with the note that indirect effects seem to matter a lot more for these groups, which might balance out that kind of accounting fiscal negative. If we look then in Ireland, we find that no recent research has looked at the fiscal impact in Ireland alone, But Ireland has been included in comparative research on this question. Generally, the findings are positive for Ireland, in that there's a positive fiscal impact of immigration, but it depends on the year. Like I mentioned, the recession really colours the research in this field in Ireland. And another caveat is that everything uses GDP as a measure, which over this period became increasingly unreliable in Ireland, which doesn't necessarily affect the story, but it affects the comparability with other countries. So OECD have done this research both in 2013 and 2021. In 2013, they looked at 2007 to 2009, which, as we all know, were not great fiscal years in Ireland. So they found that Ireland had a negative fiscal kind of impact for both migrants and natives because of the scale of the budget deficit. So it was really just reflecting kind of the budget deficit. In 2021, though, they did a longer period, so 2006 to 2018, which provides a better picture of what's actually happening in Ireland. But also, just to note, between 2006 and 2018, the government showed an overall fiscal deficit because of the scale of the deficit during the crash. So that does colour this, which you'll see. They found that in all countries, immigrants contributed more in taxes than was spent on their social protection, health, and education. But the total net contribution was small, and it really depended on the composition of the migrant populations, that's the age, but also the employment rate. So someone being in the labour market really, really changes their fiscal impact, of course, the structure of the budget, and the stage in the business cycle. So the recession. They found that when you only look at direct tax and benefits, that very kind of basic, cash in, cash out story, they found that in Ireland, migrants in Ireland contribute 1.57% of GDP, which is very close to the OECD average, and Irish born contribute more than that. So again, there's kind of more cash in, if that makes sense. But then if you include what they call congestible public goods, which is basically, public services, the costs of which increase with population size, that's things like water provision, education, and healthcare, that changes. So immigrants kind of drop a little bit because there are services being used, so to a 0.62% contribution to GDP, and the Irish born turn negative to -2%, because it's largely kind of a reflection of the population size. Then if we attribute pure public goods, and we attribute them all per capita, so that means that flood defences are attributed to all new migrants who arrive, so is the cost of the legislature, for example. Then immigrants become very slightly negative and natives become much more negative, so -6% of GDP. And again, that just reflects the fact that between 2006 and 2018, because of the impact of the recession, the Ireland was overall in a fiscal deficit. And attributing pure public goods to migrants as well as natives obviously improves the fiscal impact of natives. So migrants are contributing to paying for overall public goods in Ireland. The OECD also calculated what's called the fiscal ratio. So this looks at the ratio of revenue to expenditure. And basically you can read this as if it's bigger than one, the group contributes more than they receive. And Ireland is among the third of countries in the OECD where the fiscal ratio is considerably larger for migrants than it is for native born. So it's 1.52 for immigrants and 1.14 for Irish born, which means that immigrants over this period contribute 52% more than they receive, I believe, is the read of that. And that's all. And then if you attribute all public goods per capita, it becomes negative for both because Ireland was overall negative during this period. Another piece of research then by the Joint Research Centre calculated the net fiscal impact again of EU, non-EU and natives across the EU between 2015 and 2019. So we're kind of getting out of that crash impact in Ireland now, and found that all three groups in Ireland were positive. The EU were the most positive and the non-EU were more positive than natives. And that's quite unusual across Europe. Across Europe, generally, there's a much larger gap. So generally, Ireland has a much more positive picture among the non-EU group than a lot of other European countries. So I think we can see it. Sorry if I show you there. So the EU group is kind of lower in Ireland. And if you look at our broader reports, you'll see that the EU group has quite a different composition in Ireland, or has over the last 20 years, tend to be more kind of lower skilled Eastern European migration, which have different integration outcomes, which we'll also talk about later. And the non-EU are kind of close to neutral, where in Ireland, they're actually quite positive. Last one then is just an interesting one for this life cycle idea. So this was a paper from 2021. It was based on 2013 data. and found that Irish households have minus €2,500 fiscal impact, and EU and non-EU are close to zero. So again, this is basically looking at what was happening during the crash, because 2013 was still very much affected by the crash in Ireland. And it shows that even during the crash, migrants had a much more positive fiscal impact than natives. Immigration might play kind of a role there, where a lot of migrants kind of left the country when they lost their jobs, etc. But it kind of shows that there is still kind of an overall more positive story. They also did this life cycle analysis based on this 2013 data, and they found that all kind of had a negative fiscal impact over the life cycle, but migrants had a more negative fiscal impact. And we really say to take that with a strong pinch of salt, because it's based on 2013 data. And basically what happens is it kind of extrapolates out and says that's going to be the case, forever. Whereas we know that the economic situation changed significantly, the fiscal situation changed significantly, and also there are a lot of assumptions there about the decisions that migrants will make around staying or leaving, and costs that will be incurred as a result. So, quick summary then before I pass over to Alan to talk about social transfers more specifically. Migrants generally have a more positive fiscal impact than natives, even during the downturn, where they were both negative, but migrants only very slightly, and natives to a significant extent. The general story is that migrants entirely finance their own share of public goods, and they also contribute to financing pure public goods, except, of course, when there is a large overall fiscal deficit. Um, the age and employment rate really, really matters, which means that labour market integration is really important for the overall story of the fiscal impact of immigration. So the fiscal contribution is dampened by occupational downgrading and skills mismatch, for example. Migration trajectories really matter. So migration decision making, this of course is so retention, for example, of high skilled migrants, and also decisions to stay or leave past a certain age. The institutional context also really matters. So things like language training, support for labour market integration, and permission to work in particular. So of course, if a group doesn't have permission to work, that has quite a negative fiscal impact for that group. And we kind of point out the spouses of general employment permit holders for a long time didn't have an independent permission to work, which likely affects kind of the fiscal impact of that group. They've been granted permission to work now. And of course, most research is pre the corporate tax boom, and how you attribute these corporate taxes is probably particularly important for Ireland. And that's where Ireland would be quite unusual in the European context. And one note is that all of these take the accounting approach, so they don't estimate the indirect effects, which, as we said, are really important. And with that, we'll take questions on that later. So if you have questions, kind of make a note of them, or you can, I think, already put them into the chat. And in the meantime, I will hand over to Alan.
Great, thanks so much, Kira. So thanks for a fascinating presentation, and thanks for handing over in good time as well. So I'm going to talk about the second report this morning. This is co-authored with colleagues Anusha and Bertrand. And here we're looking specifically at the issue of social welfare receipt, comparing the immigrants and natives. So Kira, if you don't mind just moving on the slide. So a very quick introduction. I don't need to put any more emphasis on the sort of the importance of immigration in the public debate. And luckily at the Institute, partly in partnership with the colleagues in the Department of Justice, we have been over a considerable amount of time, looking at various dimensions of the immigration phenomenon. And about, so when I was looking at it now, about 13 years ago, myself, Bertrand, and a former colleague, Corona Joyce, looked at the issue that we're going to look at today, which was, in a sense, comparing the native born in Ireland with immigrants to see where there are differences in the propensity of the two groups to receive welfare. In a sense, we're now revisiting that issue. And that's what I'm going to take you through in the next few slides. So if we just move on again, Kira. The way I'm going to go about this, I'm just going to again give a very, very brief literature review. It'll only take a few minutes to give you the overall context. There is an important administrative rule here that we need to talk about, the habitual residency condition. Then I'm going to talk to you about trends in employment and unemployment, because again, that's, I think, important for the overall context. We'll do some descriptives on welfare receipt. We'll do a bit of regression, and then I'll offer some concluding thoughts. So just two headline points that we want to make. The data that we're using here is primarily from the CSO's, the Labour Force Survey, and the Survey of Income and Living Conditions. That allows us to do an awful lot. The one thing it didn't allow us to do much on was to identify Ukrainians, specifically given the sort of the recency of their arrival and the nature of their accommodations. They were a little bit more difficult to capture, but we'll dig into some other data sources in an effort to try and say something illuminating about the Ukrainians. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, and again, I think it's only one slide on the literature. But what we're doing today, it sort of taps into quite a rich seam of research that's been done in quite a number of countries. So I've listed there earlier papers by myself and Yvonne McCarthy, the paper I mentioned a few moments ago with Bertrand and Corona Joyce, but other papers from the UK, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere. And generally speaking, what all of these folks do and what we'll be doing today is to take a large scale representative sample, compare the rates of welfare receipt across the two groups. You can do that just on an average basis, or you can use regression analysis to control for the characteristics. So at one level, you might just be interested, well, are immigrants more likely to receive benefits or not? But for example, if immigrants are much younger, if they have lower levels of education, generally speaking, if they have characteristics that make it more likely that they will be in receipt of welfare, you might want to control for those sort of factors to get a sense of, well, is there something about the immigrant status specifically that might be driving differential rates of receipt? When you do these across countries, very often what you'll find is higher rates of receipts for immigrants. Okay, but when you do that regression analysis and control for those characteristics, normally what you see is any difference shrinks across the group. And again, in a lot of the countries that I mentioned above, you'll see that the difference actually goes to zero. Ireland was certainly 10, 13, 15 years ago when I was doing work in this before with colleagues. What we were finding actually was that immigrants were less likely to be receiving payments, and when you've added in the controls, in a sense, then they were even, less likely again. So the Irish migratory situation, it always seems to come up a little bit different to elsewhere. And again, we'll develop that theme. The other important point from all this literature, though, is that you can look at immigrants broadly and you can look at welfare broadly. But as might be expected, as you dig into specific groups and specific payments and specific arrangements, differences can start emerging at that point. And as I said, I'll say a little bit more about that in a couple of moments. There are two other strands of the literature here that may be of interest to folks. There's the fiscal effects literature, which Ciara has taken you through a few moments ago. But there's also that fascinating literature, which began with George Borhouse in the Journal of Labour Economics in 1999, which is the welfare magnet argument. And this is the paper that Borhouse wrote, which is now a very long time ago. And his effort, in a sense, then was to look at welfare variation across the United States and see where migrants attracted more heavily to more welfare generous states. He sort of concluded that they were, but there's been a lot of work in that area since, which in a sense has demolished that result and shown that migrants are actually much more likely to go to places with higher employment rates and higher wages, and that the attraction is more on the level of the positives, if I can put it like that, compared to the negatives. Let's just go on to the next slide then, Ciara, if I can. Okay, I did have to say there's just this very, very important administrative dimension to all this. And I think in order to understand what's happening in this area, you have to know just a small little bit about the habitual residency condition. And again, the older folks on the call will remember this, that when Ireland when the EU accession happened in 2004, Ireland was among only three countries, then the UK and Sweden and ourselves, that allowed full access to the labour market at the time. There were, of course, concerns at the time that such a liberal approach to the free movement could raise the possibility of people arriving in Ireland following the sort of the Borhouse welfare magnet type whatever approach, and that the welfare rolls could have been overburdened. So in order to sort of, in a sense, balance the liberal approach on the one hand, restrictions on welfare access were introduced. This has evolved over time, but where we are now, that in order to get benefits, you have to satisfy the HRC, not HRT, the HRC, and that's basically there's a sort of a range of questions that are asked of people. In a sense, the most tricky one, I suppose, is that you have to demonstrate that your main centre of interest is in Ireland, that you are sort of living here and located here on some sort of a permanent basis. So it's not the case that can be, generally speaking, it's not the case that people can just simply arrive and move straight onto the welfare rolls. Okay, let's get into a little bit more of the data. And I did say at the outset that before getting into the specifics of welfare, that we would just say a little bit about broader labour market indications. What we plotted here, this is from the Labour Force Survey, this is employment rates by country of birth going across 2014 to 2024. And this is one of these very, very simple but very illustrative charts. So we're comparing here the Irish and the non-Irish. And what you can see, if you go back to 2014, employment rates for both were remarkably similar, just over 60%. The post sort of crisis situation was kicking in here. So you can see how Irish employment rates started going up immediately in 2015 and beyond. It took a year or two longer for the employment rates of migrants to start increasing. But you can see from 2016, it has always been the case that the employment rates of migrants have exceeded those of the native born. If the presentation stopped now, that is a valuable, interesting, and useful finding, and one that I think on occasions comes as a surprise to people. So you can see most recently 2024, the again the gap there, close to 5 percentage points in terms of employment rates. If we go on to the next slide. Here we see the unemployment rates, okay, and it's also the case that unemployment rates have tended to be a little bit higher for migrants. Again, you can see in the chart that improvement in labour market situations of both groups after the crisis, and how we've managed to get unemployment rates down to historically low level. It can kind of come as it seems like a bit of a paradox or a bit confusing that you can have higher employment rates and unemployment rates. But of course, the resolution of that is on the next slide. So, Kara, if we can just have a quick look at the next slide. This is the activity rate. So where activity is that you either have a job or you're looking for a job. And you can see again here that the non-Irish group essentially for all of the period had higher activity rates. I think this again is important background context because it shows immigrants being a sort of a very labour market employment oriented group. And that's stronger in Ireland than it is in a number of countries, which partly explains some of the results that Ciara was talking about. And again, it's an important feed in, I think, into what we're going to show in the next couple of minutes. So let's have a look at the next slide. Please, Ciara. Okay, so now we are looking at the specific question of social welfare payments. There's a lot going on in this slide, a lot of numbers, so don't worry, I will direct you, and you'll see pretty quickly what's going on. So we've got three separate years here: 2014, 2019, 2024. And if you look at just the first row there, where we're looking at people in receipt of unemployment, disability, and family allowances, okay, and the 69 there under Irish, that's saying 69% of the population were in receipt of some sort of a welfare payment. I should just to be clear, this is between the ages of 18 and 65. We're not counting old age pensions here. That will strike everybody as being a remarkably high number, but you have to remember the family allowances includes child benefit here, okay, which because that's a universal payment, huge proportions of the population are getting that. So there you're looking at sort of 69% of the Irish, 76% of the non-nationals, but because it's such a broad payment, it probably isn't as illustrative as if you go down to the last row. And there we're just looking at unemployment, sickness, and disability payments. And there what we're saying is that in 2014, 31% of the Irish were in receipt of such a payment compared to 31% of the non-Irish. In 2019, it's 26 versus 24%. And then in 2024, we've got 23 and 20%. Where you've got stars, there's statistically significant differences. But again, if you just take that slide, it's a sort of simple form of analysis or whatever, but taking those sort of standard type of payments, comparing the Irish and the non-Irish, there is no difference in terms of the rate of receipt. And again, done a couple of interviews on this morning. That seems to come as a surprise to some people, where there may be a sort of an underlying narrative around heavier rates of welfare receipt amongst migrants, but it's just simply not in the data. Let's go to the next slide and we'll start digging around a little bit more thoroughly on this. Again, there's a lot happening on this slide. So let's try and sort of zone in. If you go sort of halfway down the slide, we've got unemployment, sickness, and disability. Okay, a row there. The proportion there for the Irish is 29%, i.e., is for Ireland. Okay, here what we've done is we've pooled all the 3 years that we were looking at, 14, 19, and 2024. So on the disability, unemployment, sickness, disability, 29% of the Irish, 32% for the UK. So that's the situation in which the UK actually have the higher rate of receipt. But then you see, actually, if you go down to the EU West, it's a lot lower, 17. If you go to the EU East, 35% higher. Asia, 20% lower. Africa, 26%, no statistical difference. And others, 21 lower, and that is statistically different. So I hope you're getting a sense here is that when you start digging into the various groups, it's not the case that the no difference applies across the group, and perhaps it's not to be somewhat expected that when you start looking at this in finer detail, you are getting a little bit more variation. Let's just go on to the next slide then, and we'll sort of think a little bit more deeply about that. Okay, so now what we're doing, the blue here is called base. So that's the idea that, before you add any of the controls that might explain the difference. So the sort of controls we're going to add to regressions here: age, gender, marital status, education, years of work, children, and immigrant year interactions. So if you go back to the introductory comments that I made, what we're trying to do here is get a sense of, well, is there something specifically about being a migrant, or if you take account of the sort of other characteristics that might lead you to be in receipt of welfare, does it have an impact? So here, positive lines mean greater likelihood of being in receipt, and then the below the line is saying lesser. So again, there isn't a very, very clear pattern. It really does sort of move around, quite a lot. But if you look at the red bars, the ones sort of, the below the line, so when you add the controls, are people more or less likely? You can see less likely for the EU West, for Asia, for Africa, and the other group. EU East is interesting in the sense that you see a 15 percentage point positive on the base. Okay, but when you add the controls, that shrinks quite considerably, and the difference then is just the 0.3 percentage points. Okay, that's all benefits. As I said earlier, that's probably distorted by some of the family benefits. So let's look at another set. And here we're looking then at unemployment, sickness, and disability. Where you see red numbers, now not the red box, but the red numbers, it means they're not statistically significantly different. But just to take two here, if you take the EU West, you can see, okay, lower rates of receipt. And when you add the controls, there is still less receipt, although it's not as pronounced. The opposite actually applies then in the case of the EU East. Okay, there you do have higher rates of receipt, and the rate actually ticks up a little bit when you add the controls. But adding the controls, you're not getting any difference then for the Asians and for the Africans. And so again, that sort of somewhat complicated picture when you're digging in very, very narrowly shows up again. We'll look at a couple more of these to give you I'm not going to go through every one in all detail, but just to sort of give you a sense of the sort of stuff that's in the paper. Obviously, there can be differences across contributory and non-contributory benefits. So here we're looking at non-contributory benefits. And again, you can sort of see a bit of a mixed pattern across the various groups. That it won't talk through all of them, but visually you can get a sense that there are the positives and there are the negatives. And how about we go on to the next slide then, Kira, as well? And here we're looking at the non-contributory benefits. And again, you can see that things sort of move around somewhat. In this case, probably the standout figure is with regard to African immigrants, where there is a substantial enough positive here, meaning a higher propensity to be in receipt of benefits. It does shrink when you add the controls, but nevertheless, it's still there. But then, counterbalanced, for example, by the EU West, where you're getting a very, very different pattern. One more set of regressions that I want to look at. Okay, and we did a very sort of specific exercise, which is we just looked at the receipt of unemployment benefits amongst immigrants who are unemployed. Okay, so this is a very, very specific case. We're looking at all payments in the contributory and non-contributory. And I think the important point to take out of this picture, okay, is generally speaking, you've got a lot of zeros, okay, which is saying that for people who are unemployed, there isn't a sense that there's an immigrant group who are more or less likely to be receiving the payments, be it on a contributory or non-contributory benefit. I know there's the Asia difference there, but generally speaking, across the picture, that's the point to be taken. Okay, next slide. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Ukrainians in the interest of making sure that we finish on time. This picture simply talks about, the arrival of the Ukrainians and the sort of the accumulation of the numbers over time. If you go to the next one immediately, Kira, please. And actually, I'm going to go to the next one again. Okay, because the left-hand picture here, to a certain extent, I think summarizes what I want to say. So here we have rates of receipt of working age income supports. Okay, now we put this together sort of based on a couple of data sources. But what's interesting about the picture is that if you go to the sort of the left-hand side, 2022, there's a very high proportion of folks who are in receipt of payments. Looks like about sort of 75%. But you see the picture over time then that the claims and the rates of receipt decline over time. They do seem to have stabilized now around the sort of the 40% mark. But it's a really interesting story in terms of sort of assimilation, people getting jobs, moving off welfare, and doing the sort of things that you would hope. I mean, obviously this is a group still suffering severe challenges in a sense, so perhaps not surprising that the rate has sort of stabilized around 40. But nevertheless, I think the dynamic is interesting, and there's a sort of a similar picture there in terms of the allocated accommodation. But again, I won't go into it in great detail. We pick it up in questions. Okay, let's just pick up a couple of conclusions. So we just go to the. Okay, so I've kind of made this point already. There's a varied picture here, okay, but let's try and just distill two conclusions, if I might. And the first one is that notion that there's generally no evidence of certainly of much greater rates of receipt amongst immigrants compared to the native born. On average, we haven't found a difference. Where we do find higher rates, the differences typically aren't enormous. And the second point I want to make is that where we looked at that very specific group of the unemployed and the unemployment payments, and we weren't capturing a difference there. Again, I think it's an important finding. It could be the case, by the way, that to the extent that immigrants experience more periods of unemployment, it could be the case that they end up getting benefits on a greater number of occasions, and that would be sort of typical about sort of more precarious working situations for immigrants. But if you look at that at a particular point in time, and you look at the unemployed natives and the unemployed immigrants at a particular point in time, we weren't picturing or capturing differences in payment probabilities. And then the last concluding slide, then, Kira, if we may. Okay, I mean, at one level, I think it's always important to stress that the welfare system is there for both the native population and for the immigrant population. And again, going back to the HRC, you know, we want to make sure we can support our immigrants in the same way that we support our natives. For some group of immigrants, it is probably the case that they experience labour market difficulties and labour market challenges. But again, you know, we have a sort of a broad set of supports for native people as well. And one thing we would sort of say is that for a lot of immigrants, if there is any sort of an observation that they need a support or assistance in terms of moving from welfare to work, the sort of supports and programs that are there and run by the Department of Social Protection and others, those are the sort of things that should generally be applying to immigrants as well as natives, and indeed they are. Where there are groups, for example, though, that have suffered, you know, intense discrimination, and we know from other ESRI research that there are such groups, it could well be the case that the standard supports are not sufficient and that you may need additional supports to combat the sort of difficulties that those people have faced, that specifically regard to discrimination. I think for people in asylum seekers, again, just people in asylum centres, we do know from sort of voluminous amounts of research that extensive periods of time out of the labour market for migrants, or for anybody for that matter, typically leads to strict scarring effects, which make it more difficult for people to get into the labour market. So there might be, again, a sort of an immigrant specific issue there. But with that, I think it's I'll just bring this presentation to a close, and I think we do have a little bit of time for Q&A, so we'll move straight on to that.
Okay. Thanks very much to both Ciara and Alan for their presentations. So if anybody has questions, you can type them into the Q&A feature there. We've got a couple already in. The first two are to Ciara. I should say we also have Evan Bertrand and Daniel, other co-authors of the two reports, online as well. So Ciara, to what extent are the findings of the fiscal impacts really driven entirely by demographics? So a question here on, given that the vast majority of migrants are working age, if you restricted the analysis just to people of working age, which I guess a little bit Alan did in the social welfare piece, would everybody be a net contributor to the public finances? And the second, slightly technical question, you mentioned the issues with the OECD study using GDP there. Would the impact of migration in Ireland ideally use GNI star, even if that made comparisons with other countries more difficult?
Okay. So firstly, on the demographics, yes, demographics are the biggest driver of the fiscal impact. So age and employment rates are really the two really important things that differentiate kind of the migrant group from the rest. And of course, then that's not talking about just your overall fiscal situation, because that, as we know, really matters. So when we look, that basically drives the majority of the fiscal positives. And so if you look at working age, yes, generally positive. And of course, then the children matter too. So you can see in Alan's analysis there, child benefit is kind of being used by largely people who have children, obviously. So the actual family structures and, you know, having people being of family age matters too. And so that's why with migration, you really have to understand that you're not talking about kind of a relatively static population that ages in a cohort, but actually you're talking about a population with a lot of churn. So most international migration and most international migrants are kind of between 20 and 45, because that's when people move, and then they tend to move home. So there was a really interesting piece by the Department of Finance, and I think some of them are on the call, which found that kind of between 10 and 40% of people on a critical skills employment permit don't stay beyond 2 years. So you're talking about quite a, yeah, and this kind of churn population. So you kind of see this little population bump that just stays a population bump essentially when you have large amounts of international migration. And that drives the fiscal impact. So hopefully now that somewhat gives you some insight into your question. And a lot of the public services in the accounting approaches are just demographically modeled. So they're not looking at actual usage. They're doing assumed usage based on demographic modeling, which doesn't necessarily reflect the reality, because we know that there's a healthy migrant effect, so migrants tend to be healthier, et cetera, et cetera. On the GNI star question, so the GNI star, if you looked at GNI star, it would just give you, it would be easier to compare with other countries in terms of in terms of the kind of comparison with GDP. But of course, what GDP, the kind of the reason that GDP is slightly skewed in Ireland has a massive fiscal effect. So how you actually reflect that. So generally corporate taxes are attributed more or less to everyone. But for example, if you were to say in Ireland, and this is more the point, it's less GNI star and GDP, it's more how you actually attribute corporate taxes. So if you attributed corporate taxes, let's say we know that a few companies are responsible for an enormous amount of our corporate taxes. If you actually said, well, how many people are migrants working in those companies, and then kind of trying to attribute it like that, that could have a much bigger impact in Ireland than it would in other countries because that's such a large chunk of our budget. Hopefully
Okay,
that's interesting.
that's good. Thanks very much, Kira. Next question is more to Alan in terms of the variation in welfare receipts between cohorts. The question here, could some of that be driven by knowledge gaps, given that some cohorts, and particularly the Eastern European migrants, tend to have been in Ireland a lot longer, so maybe have a greater understanding of eligibility and access built up. So there's a kind of a learning about the Irish system effect there.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and just to sort of say more broadly, the absence of good data on length of time in Ireland makes a lot of this analysis more complicated than it otherwise would be. So theorizing for a second then about length of time. There's a number of things that could be happening. So the questioner has asked a very, very sensible question. Well, if you're longer in the country, does it mean that you know more about the welfare system or whatever like that? It could also be that you've built up contributions or whatever like that, and so that your entitlements increase. There's almost certainly a story that's true there, and that could be part of it. But of course, the other thing is that you would expect that the longer people are in Ireland, they could also be getting sort of better jobs, more stable jobs, or whatever like that. So there's a counteracting effect, as there as well. But the other thing that really complicates the analysis, thinking about it in a temporal sort of way, of course, is that over time people come into Ireland and leave Ireland as well. And one of the relevance of this for the analysis, and myself and Bertrand and Anusha discussed this quite a lot, when we did this analysis about 15 years ago, the Eastern European migrants tended to have very low rates of welfare receipt, and that was one of the things that has changed. And we sort of have wondered again, is it a very different group of folks that are here now compared to who were here previously? And again, we know that over time, migrants can move back to their countries of origin because they've done extremely well and are then going back, or it'd be the case that they haven't done as well and they're going back. So there's an awful lot going on in terms of the temporal dimension. It is a real sort of restriction, and it's still one of these ongoing things that we really need more data. And I think there are other data sets actually now which are making more of an effort to capture that issue of time spent in the country. But for now, we're limited in what precisely we can say beyond the theorizing.
Okay. The next question is linked to data and also to maybe the value of these reports and the evidence being gathered there, which is broadly, how do you see this kind of data influencing or shifting public perception in today's political climate? So obviously, at the ESRI, we always hope that data feeds into knowledge and evidence. But I don't know if either of you wanted to comment specifically on these two reports.
Do you want to go first, Kieran?
Yep, I can give it a go. So, I mean, we know from our misperceptions report that we published in January that there are significant misperceptions about kind of, migrant integration outcomes, so things like employment. And we have a paper coming out on kind of understanding of the welfare system as well that has a really nuanced picture. We know that that affects attitudes. I would nuance it and say that, people tend to come to their attitudes and opinions not through kind of an objective analysis of the facts, but also very much through like kind of emotional, moral, vibes-based reactions. I think there's a lot of so I suppose there's a limitation to which to the extent to which kind of correcting misinformation impacts attitudes. But we do know that misperceptions is a really important plays a really important role in attitudes. So we definitely would hope that this kind of research, and that's I suppose why we do it, it's why the department funds it, to try to get more evidence into that conversation. But to the extent to which it will, I don't know if we can answer.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick add on. I think we actually need to do research on the extent to which research does have an impact. I mean, I think one of the fears I have is that I have no doubt this work will feature in social media interactions today and will be discredited in some channels, and there will be a group of people who will only read the discredited channels. And I just think it's the segmentation now of information and groups or whatever like that, that when I started as a researcher 30 plus years ago, you had a sense on a day like today, people would have read the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, a few other newspapers maybe, and listened to a couple of the news channels. But right now, once that information goes out there, it's we've very little control over it. So how it's interpreted, how it's digested, and then how it's used is not entirely clear to me. And curiously, I think it is something we need to understand more of, really.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. And both of you mentioned that migrants, and I think previous research has shown this as well, migrants are employed perhaps below their skill level. To what extent do you think barriers to qualification recognition contribute to this, and would it improve the fiscal contribution if migrants were able to work in occupations that match their qualifications and experience? Possibly, Kira, that's something you've done
Well, we
more on.
actually have quite a bit of research coming out of EMN this year on this. One of our colleagues is doing a lot of research on this, and the role of qualification recognition, which in Ireland is very fragmented. It's very complex. It can be very expensive, to have qualifications recognized. Language is also a really, really important barrier, and the two kind of go together as well. And that definitely has a fiscal impact, which I think that Alan can actually speak to more than I can, because he has done research on this in the past, the role that skills mismatching has on basically not getting the most fiscally or economically out of a migrant population. I think, Alan, you can.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think it's a pretty straightforward issue. It's just been a feature, for a long time, that notion of immigrants working below their skill set. It's interesting. It comes back to the earlier question though, that somebody asked about the temporal dimension, and it is this ongoing question that is it the case then that people it can flag or can signal in some way over time the value of their qualifications, whereby they do move up the sort of the career or occupational ladder. But we need to get back to this point of getting sort of good longitudinal data that actually allows us to see whether or not those sort of things are happening. But I know this is something too that officials, both in the Department of Justice and the Department of Enterprise, have been sort of trying to deal with over time, because the recognition of qualifications is, in a sense, is a low cost policy that allows a significant economic gain if it allows people to sort of seamlessly move through career ladders and to move into the occupations where they're at the most productive.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we're right up on noon, so I'll finish with a comment rather than a question coming into the Q&A there to say glad to hear from well-researched, data-driven narratives, which is exactly what we try to do. So thanks very much to Kieran and Alan for their presentations, to all the other authors involved in the research, and of course to the Department of Justice for funding it. And thanks to everybody on the call, and we'll end it there. Goodbye all.
So much.
Okay, thanks everybody.